Earlier this week, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Arthur Smith, at the time a major, commanding officer of D Company's 6th Royal Australian Regiment, passed away at the age of 90. He has since been laid to rest at Budrum on the Sunshine Coast. Harry Smith is famed in Australia for his command at Long Tan, the most famous engagement in the Vietnam War undertaken by Australian forces, and one of the first major engagements by Australians during the war. Now, I must warn you all, this video will include some recreations of some audio scripts, provided I can get them past the copyright censor, from the battle, and a lot of ex-military and military do watch this channel. So just a word of warning, some of these scenes may be hard to listen to, particularly if you have suffered from, or you do suffer from PTSD. And if you do, please know you're not alone, and this channel's somewhere that you very much do belong, and we do care about you here. Now, the reason Australia was in the Vietnam War, well, it's got a bit of controversy to it. It was always politically very beneficial for the United States to have other allied nations involved in the intervention in South Vietnam. Australia, being at the end of the so-called domino effect, was a really important ally in the region for the Yanks, particularly when it comes to politics. Now, there is quite a bit of conjecture as to why the Australians were in Phuoc Toi province in Vietnam. Either the region was crawling with Viet Cong and Australians were chosen for, let's just say, a particular expertise from Malaysia when it came to hunting communists in the jungle and fighting guerrilla warfare, or it was a backwater that we were shoved into to get us out of the way and we happened to find contact. Two prevailing points here. I won't attempt to argue which. For better or for worse, that is where Delta Company found itself on the 18th of August 1966. The Australians in Phuoc Toi were known as the 1st ATF, and would focus on small unit operations to search and destroy piecemeal enemy forces, rather than engaging in large-scale battles. At least that was the goal in the theory. The predominant Australian base was at Vung Tau, but there was a forward operating base at Nui Dat, near the Long Tan rubber plantation. Brigadier Jackson was given command at Nui Dat, and the idea was that anyone encountered in the area would be the enemy, and only the enemy. At Nui Dat, there were 2 battalions, about 4,000 men, a squadron of APCs, support artillery courtesy of our Kiwi brothers, and the Royal Australian Air Force, or RAAF, from support from Vung Tau in the form of Iroquois, better known as Hueys. It was truly an Anzac affair. This was a mixture of regular Australian Army forces and national servicemen, or conscripts, who, for many reasons, should have never been deployed to Vietnam in the first place, but make no mistake, these conscripts were strong fighters, good men, and from the words of the late Harry Smith himself, there was no difference, they were all diggers. Now, 6th Royal Australian Regiment, 6 RAR, is a battalion. In that battalion, there are 4 companies, A, B, C, D. Each company has 3 platoons and a company headquarters. Just to clarify, the Viet Cong are communist guerrillas, the NVA is the North Vietnamese regular army, 2 very, very different forces, so just keep that in mind. And throughout this video, I will be referring to the platoons not numbered 11, 12, 13, I'll be using their call signs as they were on the radio. So for example, the platoon that is cut off is 4-2, so that will be 2nd platoon. That's how I'll be referring to it. It's just for ease of understanding from the period, but know that they use the titles 11, 12, 13, that kind of thing throughout the battalion. They were just assigned under different companies, so I'm doing this for ease of listening's sake. On the night of the 16th and the 17th of August, Nui Dat was bombarded by mortar fire from a position 2 kilometres to the east, in the Long Tan rubber plantations. Most of the infantry at the base were deployed at the time, with 5 RAR still engaged in Operation Holsworthy, while a small party remained at the base, and a company from 6 RAR was on patrol in the northeast. The bombardment lasted for 22 minutes, damaging vehicles, tents, and wounding 24 men, one of whom later died. In response to this, 6 RAR's B Company was ordered to patrol the rubber plantation and destroy the attackers. Aussie and Kiwi gunners had returned fire effectively, and silenced the attacker, a normal shoot and scoot, as they were putting it. On the 18th, Smith and D Company were ordered out to relieve B Company, much to their annoyance because at Nui Dat there was a concert playing, and of particular note was Little Paddy, who it must be said would have been a wondrous sight for those used to patrolling the Vietnamese jungle. Grumblings aside, and believe me there were some grumblings, Delta Company headed out. Now Smith, he noticed 2 tracks, a foot track and a bullock cart track, and the bullock cart track was moving east. He ordered D Company to follow that bullock cart track. Specifically, he ordered the 2nd platoon under Lieutenant Gordon Sharp. 2nd platoon, advancing along the track, sighted 4 to 6 Viet Cong moving along it and opened fire. Surprised, the Vietnamese forces took their wounded and retreated. Now, Lieutenant Gordon Sharp, commanding 2nd Platoon, reported this to Smith, gave the order to give chase. 2nd Platoon advanced and moved forward in towards a clearing. They didn't cross into the clearing, crucially. At this point, the North Vietnamese Army, or NVA, engaged the Australians in a hail of gunfire, pinning them to the ground and wiping out a section of 2nd Platoon. Lieutenant Sharp reported that contact had been made, and the engaging force was about the size of his call sign, namely, a platoon. Crucially, and this is something that didn't go over the radio and it just didn't click, and according to the veterans of Long Tan, this did not click in their heads at the time, the uniforms that they were shooting at were green. Now, the penny hadn't dropped yet, but these weren't VC. This was the regular Vietnamese army, a very, very potent and very, very well-trained force. It became very clear as time went on that they weren't dealing with guerrillas, as the hail of fire didn't slacken with over 3 machine guns pinning down the platoon. The NVA forces were by now slowly working to encircle the Australians. The casualties in 2nd were now ratcheting up very fast at this point, with many dead and many wounded. Sections of the platoon were cut to pieces or completely pinned to the ground in a hail of fire. Lieutenant Sharp ordered another section into an enfilading position. Now, an enfilading position is where you move to effectively fire down a position lengthwise, and the combined fire of the section moving to flank brought the NVA to the ground. So both sides are now pinned to the ground, firing at each other, but the Vietnamese fire is very, very strong. We're about 5 minutes into contact. 15 more minutes passed, and NVA forces were now successfully starting to encircle the Australians and fire from multiple directions. The Australians were now estimating across the radio a company-size attack, meaning they were now outnumbered 3-1. The New Zealanders at Nui Dat on the artillery opened up a barrage forward to break up the enemy advance and to shield the Australians, beginning with a fire mission platoon, and then increasing to the point where they just did not stop firing. At this point, other platoons were now moving to assist the pinned 2nd. The calls were coming in more and more, and they were getting desperate, with orders coming over to the gunners to drop the range more and more, closer to the men taking cover. Danger close started to mean absolutely nothing. 2 kilometres away in the brush, B Company was ordered to stand firm, and they held their position. Company headquarters and Major Smith began receiving mortar fire at this point, and had to eventually take cover to ensure the artillery relay would not be ceased. The artillery at this point was the lifeline keeping 2nd alive. Smith requested at this point reinforcements, but was told blatantly there are none. 1st Platoon, under 2nd Lieutenant Jeff Kendall, were closest to the pinned 2nd, and were ordered to move fast, and they dropped packs as they moved as quickly as possible to assist by relieving pressure to allow Smith to pull 2nd out. We're about 20 minutes into contact now. The rain was now coming down hard, as it did at this time of year in Vietnam, and 1st encountered Vietnamese forces moving to attack 2nd. Engagement began, and 1st was no longer able to move because they realised very quickly this wasn't just a company, it was not just a platoon, it was something more. They were too far from their objective, they could hear each other's gunfire going on, and they were advancing firing slowly, but they were really effectively pinned in place. The artillery was coming in like a waterfall, and at this point, very crucially in the battle, 1st Platoon's radio man was shot through the shoulder and through the radio. They were now without comms. The Australian forces are quoted as saying there are hundreds of targets, and that 7.62 was flying around, and I quote, like bloody bees. Smith again radioed back to Nui Dat for reinforcements, but was told there was nobody. Failing this, he gave orders to keep the artillery coming hard and fast to provide relief. The order was given Fire Mission Regiment, and the Kiwis, and they cannot be given enough credit for this and they are often overlooked, kept up the hail of fire, along with an American 155mm battery that was now ordered to assist. And they were firing into the Vietnamese rear, about 200 metres off 2nd Platoon. It is arguable here which platoon is in worse condition. 2nd is stuck and can't move, pinned and taking casualties. 1st is completely without comms and at risk of being attacked en masse. A single brave radio operator, Billy Urkel, with the only spare radio, ran into the monsoon alone to find 1st. And he ran completely alone through an enemy territory by himself with a radio, and it was the only hope for 1st. The situation at 2nd at this point was just getting worse. The mist was now coming in thick and obscuring vision right up to the hip, and everyone's laying on the ground so they can't see. Rain was bucketing down, the artillery was meanwhile still firing, so the noise must have been horrendous. But the attacks, they just did not stop coming. The NVA forces just moved through the artillery. At this point in the hail of gunfire, 2nd Lieutenant Gordon Sharp took a round to the neck. He was killed instantly, and Sergeant Bob Buick was now in command of 2nd. Colonel Townsend and Nui Dat requested to Brigadier Jackson that the APCs to be sent out, the idea being that they could break up the attack. Now at this point, Jackson had a hard choice to make. One he is criticised for quite a bit, but when you're looking at it from the perspective going back, it can be understood why he made the decision. He didn't order the APCs out, because in his position, with 2 platoons out of contact, possibly destroyed, it was possible that in his mind, Delta Company was lost. His position was that if he sent the APCs out, all of Nui Dat could be overrun. Jackson was not prepared to take this risk, and not prepared for an Australian DMBN foo. Bill Urkel, meanwhile, was able to find first. On the way, he was intercepted by 2 VCs, and he fired his weapon, killing the 2, and proceeded on. He was lucky enough to reach first, in this sense, but first was more lucky than anything to have him show up, and they were promptly ordered to withdraw. Lieutenant Adrian Roberts, in command of the APCs, and Alpha Company, were now briefed with the hope that he could move towards to reinforce Delta in the rubber. Second, by this point, had its situation deteriorate even further, completely surrounded, attacks coming in all sides, and ammunition was incredibly low. The radio in second was now prepared after taking a bit of damage earlier, and about half the platoon at this point remained. More and more reports were coming and filtering through along the line with emergency requests for artillery, and Harry Smith now sent sections forward, but they just simply could not break through to the platoon. Sergeant Buick put it bluntly, they couldn't move. There were hundreds of men surrounding them, barely a dozen Australians still able to fight, and Smith now radioed for immediate supply via helicopter. At this point, 2nd requested a napalm strike, and American F-4 Phantoms responded. The weather though was so bad that the smoke could not be identified. Napalm didn't drop, and the artillery was resumed. RAF Group Captain Peter Rort was asked by the Australians back at Nui Dat to use his choppers to provide a resupply, and he responded that his choppers were now not allowed to fly in this kind of weather into hostile force. Flight Lieutenants Frank Riley and Flight Lieutenant Cliff Doyle stood forward at this point and said, "Let's not ask anybody, because they can't say no." They took off with the ammunition, to hell with the orders, and flew towards Long Tan. 2nd was now in an even worse position. Those with automatic weapons were ordered to fire single shots. 1st couldn't get there, nobody could, and the enemy was now within 50 yards of their position. Sergeant Buick gave the order, "Target artillery on my location." And this was truly the lowest point in the battle for the Australians, and the radio traffic transcripts show this. As far as they knew, 2nd was gone, and it must be given credit to the New Zealanders for being able to follow this order. The 18 guns at this point in the artillery battery were firing 6 to 8 rounds a minute. And while they didn't know it yet, those who would survive in 2nd are alive because of these gunners, and the New Zealanders, who are often so forgotten in this battle, deserve all the praise in the world for what they did. They are the reason this battle is listed as an Australian victory, not a disastrous defeat. Colonel Townsend was pushing Brigadier Jackson, and he agreed. B Company was ordered back into the rubber, and A Company, with the APCs, were ordered to assault Delta's position. Within Delta, there was on average less than 1 round left, and the RAF boys who took off with boxes of ammunition dropped it all towards the red smoke that they saw, giving the Australians the chance to stay in the fight. I can't understate, if the RAF hadn't dropped that ammunition, every single man in Delta probably would have been dead. After the drop, CSM Jack Kirby, who was Smith's very loyal company sergeant, quickly distributed the ammunition, throwing it out to every single man. 3rd Platoon, who we haven't heard about yet, was under Lieutenant Sabin. It had pushed forward to hold open a corridor to Buick's remains of 2nd. Only about 7 or 8 men in 2nd were actually able to fight. With their radio gone permanently, Buick was able to move and get the men who were alive away. To quote Buick when referring to the men left on the ground, "There was nothing more I could do for them." 3rd threw yellow smoke and saw the remains of 2nd coming towards them, and it must have been an incredible sight, because every single man in 2nd had taken something, or if they hadn't taken something, they were absolutely shattered. Delta was now able to completely regroup. The APCs, now leaving Nui Dat, were almost outside of the base perimeter, but Colonel Townsend turned around and gave the order that 2 of them had to come back to pick him up. The mud and the rain had progressively been reducing visibility to nothing, and the order went out to remove hats to distinguish who was who. Sergeant Jim Todd, also known as Paddy, was shot through the ankles on the way to relieve 2nd, and he crawled his way up to the Australian line but couldn't make it further. Calling out, his mate, Corporal Henry Thomas Lear, known as Buddy, broke cover and ran out into the open, picked up his friend, threw him over the shoulder, and carried Paddy to safety. Buddy would be shot 3 times during this selfless act, but would survive. He would later go on to say, "It was if someone had just walked up and tapped me. You don't know when you get shot." Although Buddy Lee would never say it, he was an absolute hero, and he passed away in Hervey Bay on the 13th of September 2014, having lived a long life after this battle. The artillery at this point was dropping so close to Delta that the term danger close might well have been a bit of black humour. The Australians repeatedly saw the NVA lining up in front of them, preparing for final assaults, and Colonel Townsend said to Harry Smith that he was now on his way. Smith replied in a complete matter of fact, "If the APCs aren't here soon, don't bother." The APCs were in the rubber, firing and carving a path through, but they were quickly held up by an intense rain of fire. A Company leapt from the carriers, and by using the cover fire from the 50s and the 30 caliber guns on the APCs, and these are M113s, were able to break a hole through, and then they reboarded and kept going. Delta now was in a ditch, and it was holding on, wounded everywhere, and the water was pouring down. The medics are on record saying they nearly had men drowning in the mud. Doc Dobson, who it must be said, is an unsung hero of this battle, and he saved every single wounded man in that ditch, all 22 of them. Something that he himself didn't believe was possible. Now back to the APCs, they were pushing, and they were pushing hard, and they were starting to take casualties. North Vietnamese forces were now preparing to assault Delta in a final wave. Harry Smith gave the order to the artillery, drop 50, and the report came back as negative, unsafe. Smith's demeanour broke at this point, and he put it bluntly, "Fire the bloody guns where we want, or you'll lose the lot of us." The report came back confirming the drop, and the guns opened. Smith gave the order to shrink the perimeter and protect the wounded in a last stand. With ammunition running out, bayonets, knives, and entrenching tools were now drawn, and the Australians themselves prepared to be overrun. In an almost divine intervention, and with a flair for timing as the sun went down, the APCs arrived, with the 50 caliber and 30 caliber machine guns opening up right above the heads of Delta. The time was about 7:10 PM. It had been 3 hours. The North Vietnamese broke off, and it was over. The only sound on the battlefield was the sound of the APC's engines ticking down. After surviving this ordeal, Delta went back into the rubber the next day to find the missing men from 2nd. And they found every single one of them, dead or alive. In probably the most iconically Australian moment from the battle, Private Miller, who was thought dead, was found slumped up against the tree. And as the Australians walked towards him, he said in the most Australian way possible, and I'll do my best to emulate it, "Where the fuck have you been?" And to this day, that line, it resonates so hard with every Australian because you can just imagine it in your head. Exactly how he would have said it. On the battlefield, Delta Company left 245 North Vietnamese confirmed dead, with a reported 350 estimated wounded. The government of North Vietnam, now Vietnam, claimed to this day that only 50 were dead and 100 wounded. However, these bodies were counted to the best of the ability by Australian soldiers at the time and were buried by them as well. Now, while burying the bodies, General Westmoreland visited the battlefield and told the Australians they had done a very good job. But this was the hard part, the cleanup. A single digger stood up from the hole in the filth, covered in all manner of human body parts and mud, and quite simply put it, "She'll be right, mate." On the Australian side, 18 were dead, 24 were wounded. I'm going to list every single one of their names, because it's important. It's important that we all remember them. Private Richard Aldersey, Corporal Peter Clements, Private Glenn Drabble, Private Kenneth Grant, Private Ernest Grant, Private Victor Grice, Private James Houston, Lance Corporal Jack Jury, Private Paul Large, Private A. McCormack, Private Dennis McCormack, Private Warren Mitchell, Private Douglas Salverton, Second Lieutenant Gordon Sharp, Private David Thomas, Private Francis Top, Private Maxwell Wales, Private Colin Whiston. Long Tan became synonymous with the Australian Vietnam experience. Long Tan Day, now Vietnam Veterans Day, every August is celebrated to remember these men, and every man who fought and died in Vietnam. This year marked 50 years since the end of Australia's involvement in Vietnam, and we rejected them when they came home, our Vietnam veterans that is. They were shunned, they were ignored, and they were treated horribly. Today, thankfully, we remember them, and as time goes on I want to point something out. When I was born, the Second World War was around 50 years old. It is now almost 80. Talk to your veterans, I implore you, talk to them. Remember their story if they are willing to tell it, and pass it on. Our Vietnam vets are now starting to pass away. It's been a long, long time. Our Korean vets have largely been forgotten, and we are running the risk again of shunning and treating our Afghan vets the same way we treated our Vietnam vets. Rest in peace, Harry Smith, and to all those Vietnam veterans, and to all those veterans that history has forgotten. Lest we forget.